Hello everyone, welcome to this video. In this video, we're going to be looking at client-side exploitation. More specifically, we're going to be looking at client-side exploitation with the BeEF framework or the BeEF framework, depending on how you want to pronounce it. Alright, so you might be asking yourself, well, what exactly is client-side exploitation? Well, simply put, client-side exploitation is the process of attacking a client, more specifically attacking the operating system and the programs that are installed on the client's computer. Alright, so essentially what you're doing, what the main objective is to find the exploits that run on the client's operating system and more specifically on the programs installed on that operating system and to exploit them. Alright, so now you might be asking, well, what exactly are we looking at in this video? When in this video, we're going to be looking at how to use BeEF to essentially exploit the browser vulnerabilities. Alright, so you might be asking yourself now again, what is BeEF? Well, BeEF essentially allows you to find and exploit vulnerabilities in browsers. Alright, so it is a fantastic exploitation tool that allows you to hook browsers and then to exploit those browsers on the client operating systems and computers. Okay, so it is a fantastic phishing tool. It is a fantastic tool that allows you to perform phishing attacks. The fantastic thing is that it runs on a web interface. All right. So now we have to look at some very, very important terminology and some prerequisites for the video. Okay, so by default, we're going to be running this now on a client. All right. So what do I mean by this? We're not going to be running this on a server. So no Metasploitable 2 this time. We're going to be using a Windows operating system. More specifically, we're going to be using Windows 7 and we're going to be exploiting or hooking the browser, which is in this case Mozilla Firefox, and we're then going to be finding exploits that we can run on the browser. Alright, so BeEF is a fantastic penetration testing framework that allows you to test for vulnerabilities and exploits on browsers. So let's get started. Now by default, as I said, we're going to be using Windows. You can use any operating system, any Windows operating system or computer that is running on your network. Okay, so this is going to be performed on our local area network. So if you want to use BeEF on computers or clients that are outside your network, or in simply put terms, computers that are across the world via the internet, you then need to set up port forwarding. But that is an advanced topic that we'll probably discuss in another course. But for now, we're going to focus on performing this on our local area network in our virtual lab. Okay, so by default, the BeEF framework is pre-installed on Kali Linux, which is fantastic. All you need to do is just update your repositories and update your packages and have it installed to the latest framework. So it is usually found on the dock here. So on your left, if you just go to this cow image here, by default, you have the BeEF cross-site scripting framework. So that is what XSS denotes. Alright, so it can also be found in the applications menu. If you go to the applications and you go to exploitation tools, you'll find it under the Armitage. You'll find it there, BeEF XSS framework. So you can start it directly from here and it's going to start the BeEF service for you. Or instead you can go to the user directory and the actual BeEF directory and start the service from there. I'm going to be showing you two of those ways of starting it. So if we start it from here, if I just click on this, or you start it from the dock, it's essentially going to start the BeEF services. It's just going to display some information here that is very, very critical. So I want you to leave this terminal open. And once it's done, it's going to open up BeEF in your browser. So give it a few seconds. There we are. And welcome to BeEF. So now it's going to display to you this authentication screen. Don't worry about the username and password combination. We'll get to that in a second. So that is the first way of launching BeEF. The second way is going to the directory, which can be found at cd user share and the BeEF cross-site scripting folder. So if I click on that and I just list the files in here, you can see we have the BeEF executable. So if we just launch it by using the shell execution here, so we just type in BeEF and just hit enter and it's going to start up BeEF from there. Alright, so we have already started it, so we do not have to do it that way. Now it's going to display some information here that is very, very important. And we need to look at some of the terminology before we get started. So you might have heard of me saying things like hook. Alright, so the most important thing with BeEF is hooking. Alright, so you might be asking yourself, well, what exactly is hooking? What is the hooking process? Alright, so the hooking process is essentially getting the client to click on a link that contains the JavaScript file, the hook JavaScript file. And then that JavaScript file will be processed by the client's web browser. And then it will tie their browser back to the BeEF server. Alright, so simply put, essentially what the process of hooking is getting your client or your target to click on a link that contains the JavaScript hook file. That JavaScript hook file will then be processed, and then that browser will be hooked or tied back to the BeEF server. Alright, so that is the hooking process. So you might be asking, how do we go about doing this? Well, as you can see, the information provided to you firstly is the BeEF server URL or the interface URL. As you can see, it can be found by going to HTTP 127.0.0.1. The port is 3000 and UI panel. So if we go back to the browser, you can see that indeed it is running on that. So that is just the BeEF framework. Looking at the hook.javascript file, you can see it right here, right? So it's going to give you a hook right here. So the hook, this is very, very important. It is essentially a JavaScript file that you would include in a web page. All right. So now you might be asking, well, how are we going to actually emulate this on our virtual environment? Well, what we're going to do is we're going to start a local web server here on our Kali Linux machine. And then we are going to incorporate this, the JavaScript, this script right here into the header section of the web page. And then we will then send the IP address to the browser that we want to hook, and it's going to open the web page, and furthermore the browser will then be hooked. Okay, so the first thing we need to do is we're going to be using the Apache web server on Kali Linux. All right, so that is very important. The second thing we need, as you can see, if you look at the script right here, it's going to give you an option to enter your IP address. Now the IP address that it's asking for is the IP address in which the BeEF framework server is running on. In this case, it's running on the Kali Linux virtual machine. So we need to get the Kali Linux IP address, in this case, the local IP address. So we're going to click on a terminal and we're just going to hit ifconfig. All right. And once we get the local IP address right here, which is 192.168.1.106, that is what we needed. All right. Fantastic. So we just need to keep that in mind. And now as I said, we need to start the local web server, which in this case is Apache. How do we start that service? We go to service, Apache 2 and start. All right. So very, very simple to how we started our network services. So I'm just going to hit enter. Fantastic. So now the web server is started. Now we need to actually edit the web page file that is hosted on our web server. So that can be found by going into your file explorer and going into other locations, going into your computer, going to your var folder, into your www folder, that is where your web server files are going to be stored, your local web server files. Just click on that and then you'll find an HTML folder, click on that, and then you'll find an index.html file in here. If yours is empty, just create an index.html file and we'll add some code into it to just make it a simple web page. Okay. So if you do not have any files, just create one. If you have any files, just get rid of them and create a new one. All right. So I've already created one. So what I'm going to do is we're going to edit it with our text editor. So I'm just going to open it up with LeafPad. All right, fantastic. So once I've opened it up with LeafPad, you can see that I've just created a simple HTML template here. If you're familiar with web development, you know this is a very, very simple website. Essentially what's happening here is it's going to essentially display welcome to the site, and it's going to say this is a hooked server. So we know that this web page has been opened successfully. All right. So as I said, by default in HTML, any JavaScript code is supposed to be included in the head section of the web page. All right. So it's supposed to be included within the opening and closing tag, the opening and closing head tag. All right. So what we're going to do is we're just going to go to the information that was provided to us here, and we're going to copy the script file. All right. So we're just going to copy it like so, and we're going to paste it in the head section here. Now we need to change the IP address to the IP address or in which the BeEF framework server is being hosted, which in this case we saw as the Kali Linux IP address here. So there we are, 192.168.1.106. That is the iNet address there. So we're just going to change it to that. So 192.168.1.106. And you want to make sure that the port is 3000 and it is using the hook.javascript file. Fantastic. So let's save this. And now essentially what happens is when anyone will access this IP address here, in which we have the local host or the local web server, it is going to execute the hook.javascript file, and that will tie the browser to the, or will essentially hook the browser and will be able to access and exploit it from the BeEF framework web interface, all right, that we already have opened. Okay, that was a mouthful. Now let's get to actually executing this on our browsers. So once you've hit save, so you can just save it, and I've saved it, so we don't need to worry about that now. Pardon me. So now what we need to do is we can close that and we can leave this open now. We've started the Apache 2 service. Now we need to log into the BeEF framework user interface. So the default username is BeEF, all right, and the default password is BeEF. Fantastic. That's quite simple, isn't it? So we're just going to log in and welcome to BeEF. Now, by default, the interface that you will get if this is your first time running it will be pretty much the same, apart from having information here. So for example, I already have been performing penetration tests with BeEF before. So I already have an IP address or a browser hooked here. So don't worry about that. Essentially if you look at the basic interface here, it's really simple. On your left tab, you have your hooked browsers, and they're sorted in terms of online and offline. In this case, I have an offline hooked browser here, and I have no online browsers, but we'll be getting to that in a second. You have your getting started guide here, and you have your logs here. We'll be looking at that in a second. Fantastic. So we've started the BeEF framework. Now we need to actually run the HTML file on browser. In this case, we're going to be running this on our Windows 7 operating system here. So this is a fantastic, a fantastic opportunity for me to actually demonstrate what a client would do. So for example, now, if I just opened up my browser, all right, and I send my client or a target that I want to attack, I send them a link that contains the JavaScript file. So in this case, the link is it's hosted on our local servers, which is in this case 192.168.1.106. So once I hit enter, it's going to load up the local server and it's going to display the HTML file that we created and the file that contains the hook.javascript file. So once I hit enter, as you can see, it's going to display the information that we added to the web file, which is welcome to the site. This is a hooked server file. Now you might be asking, well, what exactly has happened? Has this browser been hooked? The answer is yes, it has been hooked. If we go back to Kali Linux and we open up our BeEF web interface, you can see if we go to online browsers, it has been hooked. And the IP address is 192.168.1.110. So you might be still skeptical and you might be asking, well, how do I know that's the correct browser that has been hooked? So let me just go back and I'm just going to run an ipconfig command here to just show you that that is the correct IP address. So let me just open a command prompt, ipconfig, and as you can see, the IP address is 192.168.1.110. Fantastic. So we have hooked a browser. Now you might be asking, well, what do we do now? Well, fantastic. We have actually hooked a browser. How do we get to exploit it? Well, the first thing we need to look at is we click on the hooked browser here. It's going to display some information here, which is very important. It's going to display information about the browser. So by default, it's going to display information about the browser. So you have your browser version, the browser string, which in this case is information about the browser. In this case, it is running Mozilla. We have the browser language, the browser platform, which in this case is Windows 32-bit. Excellent. You then have the window size in terms of what is the resolution of the window of the browser. We then have the browser components. So is it running Adobe Flash? So that means we won't be able to exploit any Adobe Flash vulnerabilities. So again, information gathering is also a part here. Okay, so we then have information like session cookies. Interesting. So that means we can actually get some session cookies. Very important thing to keep in mind. You then have information about the hooked web page, which is the web page we created. You then have information about the host, which is the operating system, and the hardware, which in this case we have not been able to get. It'll also display useful information like whether or not the device is a touch screen. In this case, it's not. So now it's time to look at some basic exploitation. Now we have looked at already how to hook the browser. Let's look at a very simple exploit process. Now by default, I just want to say something. Not every browser is going to be a fully vulnerable browser, in the sense that all the major browsers that you'll find out there, for example, Mozilla Firefox, Google Chrome, will have exploits patched or fixed. So it's going to be very difficult or very tricky to find exploits that are not already patched. All right, so you can only get a certain amount of information. If you're lucky and a browser has not patched a certain vulnerability, you can essentially get information from there. All right, but by default, BeEF can be very powerful if you actually find a vulnerability that works. All right, so we're going to go into commands. All the modules can be found in commands. All right, the rest of these sections are more of an advanced feature that we'll probably look at in an advanced course. But for now, let's look at some basic exploitation. All right, so what we can do is if we look at the modules here, they're sorted in terms of browser, Chrome extensions. That is if you're running a Chrome, if you're hooked a Chrome browser, you then have your debug, your exploits, Metasploit. You can run Metasploit exploits on it. You can perform social engineering, etc. All right, so now looking at information that we can use here, we already knew that we do not have Adobe Flash running. So it would be pointless trying to actually run any Adobe Flash exploits. Okay, so looking at some of the modules we can actually run, we can play a sound, we can remove the hook element, we can unhook the browser, we can you can take pictures using the webcam. Now by default, as I said, this might not work depending on the browser that you're using. Most of if your client is running an outdated browser, then it might work, but by default it will not work. All right. You can look at the visited URLs. So if you check for a URL here, so let's say if I tested something like let's say we wanted to know if our target has visited a website like www.bbc.com, we would enter that in here and we would hit execute. All right. And once we hit execute, what would happen is a command would be stored in the module results history section here that will log the commands that you've entered. And as you can see, it's going to give you the command results. So in this case, it's going to tell us that did the client browser, did it access bbc.com? It's going to return it as false, which means that no, it did not access that URL. So that is an exploit that works and you can test it out for yourself. Looking at things like the webcam, this uses Adobe Flash. So, you know, essentially you can use your social engineering text here. If it had Adobe Flash installed, what you would need to do is actually allow the webcam module to be installed here. So what we can do is we can just change the text here. So let's change the text to something interesting. We can say, hello, you have been hacked. All right. Something really simple like that. And let's see whether it is actually able to exploit and run this social engineering text. By default, it is not going to be able to take any pictures with the webcam because, as I said, the browser is not running Adobe Flash. All right. So we'll change the title to say you have been hacked. And if we hit execute, we can go to the Windows 7 operating system and we open up our browser. And as you can see, you have been hacked. And for some reason, I misspelled have there. Let me just change that and make sure that that is correctly spelled. And we can execute that again. So you have been hacked. Let me execute that again. And voila, as you can see, it displayed a message. Now by default, it's supposed to ask you to install or to enable the webcam to take pictures. And by default, a user will be smart enough to understand that that is something very dangerous to do. So it's really about social engineering and getting the client or the user or your target to click on things that will eventually exploit or get their browsers exploited. So that was exploitation with the BeEF framework, more specifically client-side exploitation. And it's really interesting to see how, you know, these exploits can be readily done and performed even on a small scale on your local area network. All right, so that's going to be it for this video. In the next video, we'll be looking at client-side attacks, this time using the social engineering toolkit. So I'll be seeing you in the next video.